Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. Good evening everyone. I have been a mortician at Oakwood Memorial Chapel for 14 years. In that time, I have prepared over 3,200 bodies for burial, worked through countless nights alone with the deceased, and witnessed every manner of death that a mid-sized city can produce. I thought I understood the nature of death, the finality of it, the peaceful silence that follows when life leaves the body. My name is Gregory, and what I am about to document occurred during the night shift of October 31st, 2023, Halloween night, though I can assure you that what happened had nothing to do with seasonal superstitions or holiday pranks. What I experienced that night challenged everything I believed about death and the boundary between the living and the deceased. Our funeral home operates with a skeleton crew during overnight hours, typically just myself and occasionally a security guard, though budget cuts had eliminated the security position 6 months earlier. The night shift is when most of the preparation work happens, when families aren't present, and the building is quiet enough for the meticulous process of embalming and body preparation to proceed without interruption. October 31st started as a routine evening. I had arrived at 10 p.m. to find 3 bodies waiting for preparation, victims of a multi-vehicle accident that had occurred 2 days earlier. The crash had happened on Interstate 75 during rush hour traffic, involving a semi-truck that had lost control due to brake failure. The resulting pileup claimed 3 lives and injured dozens more. The first victim was a 34-year-old construction worker named Timothy Pruitt. He had been driving home from his job site when the accident occurred. The impact had been severe, but the damage was primarily internal, making him a relatively straightforward case for preparation. His family had requested a viewing for the following evening, so my work needed to be completed by morning. The second victim was 67-year-old Eleanor Vance, a retired school teacher who had been traveling to visit her grandchildren. Eleanor's injuries were more extensive, requiring significant reconstruction work, but nothing beyond my experience and skill level. Her funeral was scheduled for November 2nd, giving me adequate time for the necessary preparation. The third victim was the reason I will never forget this night. Lauren McIntyre was 28 years old, a pediatric nurse who had been driving home from her shift at Children's Hospital when the accident occurred. According to the police report, her car had been struck twice. First, by the initial vehicle that swerved to avoid the truck, and then crushed by the semi-trailer itself. By all medical accounts, Lauren had died instantly from massive trauma to her head and chest. What made Lauren's case unusual was not the extent of her injuries, though they were considerable, but the circumstances of her arrival at our facility. She had been pronounced dead at the scene by paramedics, transported to the hospital for official pronouncement, and then held in the morgue for nearly 48 hours before being released to our funeral home. The delay was due to family members traveling from out of state and some insurance complications that needed to be resolved before funeral arrangements could proceed. During those 48 hours in the hospital morgue, Lauren's body had been stored at the standard temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit. When she arrived at our facility Tuesday afternoon, she was still in excellent condition for preparation, showing none of the decomposition that might be expected after that length of time. Her family had requested a closed casket funeral, citing the severity of her injuries, but they wanted to have the option to view her privately before the service if they changed their minds. I began working on Timothy Pruitt first, completing his preparation by 1:30 a.m. Eleanor Vance took slightly longer due to the reconstruction required, and I finished with her by 3:45 a.m. Lauren McIntyre was scheduled to be my final case of the night, which meant beginning her preparation around 4 a.m., typically the quietest hour in any funeral home. I had been working as a mortician long enough to develop a routine for managing the psychological aspects of the job. Dealing with death daily requires a certain emotional detachment and professional focus that can be maintained through systematic procedures and clinical thinking. I always began each case by reviewing the medical examiner's report, studying photographs of the deceased taken before the accident or illness, and planning the specific steps needed for preparation. Lauren's file contained a driver's license photo showing a young woman with auburn hair, green eyes, and a warm smile that suggested someone who genuinely cared about others, fitting for a pediatric nurse. The medical examiner's report documented extensive trauma to her skull and chest cavity, with the cause of death listed as massive internal bleeding and brain hemorrhage resulting from blunt force trauma. At 4:05 a.m., I wheeled Lauren's body from the refrigeration unit into Preparation Room 2, the larger of our 2 embalming suites. The room was equipped with stainless steel preparation tables, industrial lighting, ventilation systems, and all the instruments and chemicals necessary for the embalming process. I had performed hundreds of similar procedures in this same room over the years, and the familiar environment usually helped maintain the clinical mindset necessary for the work. Lauren's body was covered by a standard white sheet when I positioned her on the preparation table. I followed my usual procedure of photographing the body as received, documenting any personal effects or jewelry, and conducting an initial visual examination to assess the extent of preparation needed. This preliminary assessment is crucial for planning the embalming process and determining what reconstruction or cosmetic work might be required. When I pulled back the sheet to begin my examination, I immediately noticed something that seemed inconsistent with the medical examiner's report. While Lauren had clearly suffered severe trauma, her facial features were relatively intact, much more so than I would have expected based on the description of her injuries. Her auburn hair was matted with dried blood, but her face showed only minor abrasions and some swelling around her left eye. More puzzling was her expression. Most accident victims display facial tension or distortion consistent with the trauma they experienced. Lauren's face appeared remarkably peaceful, almost as if she had died in her sleep rather than in a violent collision. Her lips were slightly parted, and her eyes were closed in a way that suggested restful sleep rather than sudden death. I proceeded with the standard external examination, documenting injuries and assessing the condition of various body systems. The trauma to her chest was extensive, as described in the medical examiner's report, but much of it was internal damage that wouldn't affect the cosmetic presentation for viewing. Her arms and legs showed minor cuts and bruising consistent with the accident, but nothing that couldn't be concealed with proper preparation and cosmetics. At 4:25 a.m., I began the embalming process by making the initial incision to access the carotid artery and jugular vein. This is always the most critical step in preparation, requiring precision and steady hands to ensure proper preservation and appearance. I had made this same incision thousands of times over my career, and the procedure had become almost automatic. As I made the incision in Lauren's neck, I noticed that her blood had not coagulated to the extent I would normally expect after 48 hours post-mortem. The blood flow, when I accessed the carotid artery, was more fluid than typical, though this could be explained by the refrigeration and the fact that she was a young, healthy individual before the accident. I connected the arterial tube and began the process of draining blood while simultaneously introducing embalming fluid. The embalming machine's pump created its familiar rhythmic sound as it circulated the preservative chemicals through Lauren's cardiovascular system. This process typically takes 45 minutes to an hour, during which time I usually work on other aspects of preparation or begin working on the next case. But as the embalming fluid began circulating through Lauren's body, I started to notice changes that were completely outside my experience with deceased patients. Her skin tone, which had been the typical pale gray of death, began to show subtle color improvement that went beyond what embalming fluid normally achieves. Most significantly, the minor abrasions on her face appeared to be healing, actually closing and fading in real time as I watched. At 4:40 a.m., I observed something that made me question my own perception. Lauren's facial expression seemed to have changed slightly. The peaceful, sleeping appearance I had noted earlier was shifting towards something that looked more like awareness, as if she were in the process of waking up rather than being preserved for burial. I checked the embalming machine to ensure it was functioning properly. The fluid levels were normal, the pump was operating at the correct pressure, and the arterial flow was proceeding as expected. But Lauren's body was responding to the embalming process in ways that defied everything I knew about post-mortem physiology. By 5 a.m., the color in Lauren's cheeks had improved dramatically. Her lips, which had been pale and slightly blue when I began, now showed a natural pink tone that made her appear to be sleeping rather than deceased. Most disturbing was the warmth I could feel when I touched her skin, not the cold of death and refrigeration, but the gentle warmth of living tissue. I had been working as a mortician for 14 years, and I had never encountered anything like what I was witnessing. Dead bodies do not warm up during embalming. They do not show improving color beyond the artificial preservation achieved by the embalming chemicals, and they certainly do not appear to heal from injuries while lying on the preparation table. At 5:15 a.m., I noticed movement. It was subtle at first, so slight that I convinced myself it was my imagination or a trick of the lighting. But as I continued to observe Lauren while the embalming process continued, the movement became undeniable. Her chest was rising and falling in a barely perceptible rhythm, as if she were breathing. I immediately checked for a pulse, placing my fingers on her wrist and then her neck. What I found was impossible. A faint but steady heartbeat, approximately 45 beats per minute, much slower than normal, but definitely present. I checked again, using different fingers and different positions, convinced that I was feeling my own pulse reflected through my fingertips. But the rhythm was different from my own, and it was definitely coming from Lauren's body. The rational part of my mind insisted that what I was observing was impossible. Lauren McIntyre had been pronounced dead at the accident scene by qualified paramedics. She had been examined by emergency room physicians and officially pronounced dead by a doctor at the hospital. She had been stored in a refrigerated morgue for 48 hours. She had shown no signs of life when she arrived at our funeral home or during the first 4 hours she had been in our care. But the evidence before me was undeniable. Lauren McIntyre, who should have been dead for over 2 days, was showing unmistakable signs of life while lying on my embalming table with preservation chemicals circulating through her cardiovascular system. At 5:25 a.m., Lauren opened her eyes. They were the same green eyes I had seen in her driver's license photo, but now they were looking directly at me with an expression of confusion and fear. She tried to speak, but the arterial tube in her neck prevented any sound except a faint gurgling. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the stainless steel surfaces, the medical equipment, and then focusing on me in my surgical scrubs and protective gear. The terror in her eyes was unmistakable. She was awake, aware, and trying to understand why she was lying naked on a metal table in a room that clearly wasn't a hospital, with tubes connected to her neck and the smell of embalming chemicals in the air. I immediately stopped the embalming machine and began disconnecting the arterial tube, though my hands were shaking so severely that it took several attempts. Lauren's eyes followed my movements, and she tried to sit up, but she was too weak to lift herself from the table. When I removed the tube from her neck, she was able to make weak vocal sounds, though nothing resembling coherent speech. "Lauren," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and professional despite the impossibility of the situation, "you're in a funeral home. There's been a mistake. You're supposed to be dead." Her eyes widened further at my words, and she managed to whisper, "What happened to me?" I had no answer for her question because I had no medical or scientific explanation for what I was witnessing. According to every piece of documentation I had, Lauren McIntyre had died in a car accident on October 29th. She had been examined by multiple medical professionals, stored in a morgue, and delivered to our funeral home for burial preparation. Yet here she was, conscious and speaking, after having preservation chemicals pumped through her body for nearly an hour. "I need to call for medical help," I told her, reaching for the phone in the preparation room. "You need to get to a hospital immediately." As I dialed 911, Lauren managed to sit up on the preparation table, though she was obviously weak and disoriented. She looked down at her body, seeing the surgical incision in her neck and the evidence of the embalming process that had been underway. The realization of what had been happening to her caused her to scream, a sound of horror and disbelief that I will never forget. The 911 operator answered on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency? This is Gregory at Oakwood Memorial Chapel, I said, my voice barely steady. I need an ambulance immediately. I have a woman here who was pronounced dead 2 days ago, but she's alive and conscious. There was a pause before the operator responded. Sir, did you say someone who was pronounced dead is now alive? Yes. I was preparing her body for burial, and she woke up during the embalming process. She needs immediate medical attention. I'm dispatching an ambulance to your location immediately. Stay on the line with me. Is the person breathing and conscious? I looked at Lauren, who was now sitting on the edge of the preparation table, trying to cover herself with the sheet while staring at me with a mixture of fear and confusion. Yes, she's conscious and breathing, but she's been dead for 2 days. This shouldn't be possible. The ambulance arrived at 5:47 a.m., followed shortly by police officers who had been dispatched to investigate what must have seemed like an impossible emergency call. The paramedics who entered the preparation room were the same ones who had pronounced Lauren dead at the accident scene 2 days earlier. The lead paramedic, a veteran EMT named Stephen O'Rourke, stopped in his tracks when he saw Lauren sitting on the preparation table. That's Lauren McIntyre, he said to his partner. I pronounced her dead Tuesday morning. There's no way she can be alive. But Lauren was undeniably alive. Her vital signs, when the paramedics checked them, were weak but stable. Her blood pressure was low, her heart rate was slower than normal, but she was responsive to questions and able to move her arms and legs. The embalming chemicals in her system would need to be addressed immediately at the hospital, but she showed no signs of toxicity or organ damage that might be expected from having preservation fluids circulated through her body. As the paramedics prepared to transport Lauren to the hospital, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. What day is it? She asked. November 1st, I told her. You were unconscious for 2 days. Lauren stared at me for a long moment before speaking again. I remember the accident. I remember the other car hitting me, and then the truck. I remember everything going black. She paused, looking around the preparation room again. But I also remember dreaming. For a very long time. Dreams about being in a dark place where I couldn't move or speak, but I could hear everything that was happening around me. The paramedics loaded Lauren onto a stretcher and transported her to the same hospital where she had been pronounced dead 2 days earlier. The emergency room physician who had signed her death certificate was called in to examine her, and the medical team ran extensive tests to understand how someone could survive for 48 hours in refrigerated storage and then wake up during embalming. The police interviewed me extensively about what had occurred, documenting the timeline of events and collecting evidence from the preparation room. The detective assigned to the case, a 20-year veteran named Gerald Rourke, admitted that he had never encountered anything like Lauren's situation in his entire career. Mr. Gregory, Detective Rourke said, I need you to understand that what you're describing is medically impossible. People don't come back from the dead after 2 days. There has to be some explanation that makes sense. But there wasn't a rational explanation. Lauren McIntyre had been examined by multiple medical professionals and declared dead. She had been stored at temperatures that would preserve a corpse, but would be fatal to a living person. She had shown no vital signs for 48 hours, yet she had awakened during embalming as if from a deep sleep. Over the following days, Lauren's case attracted national media attention and medical experts from around the country. Specialists in emergency medicine, neurology, and forensic pathology studied her medical records and examined her to try to understand what had happened. The theories ranged from extremely rare medical conditions that could simulate death to the possibility that she had never actually died but had been in some form of suspended animation. Dr. Vanessa Redfield, a neurologist specializing in consciousness disorders, examined Lauren and found evidence of what she described as profound neurological disruption, consistent with severe trauma, followed by an equally profound recovery that defied medical explanation. Lauren's brain scans show patterns that suggest she experienced something similar to a deep coma. but her cellular activity and neurological responses indicate that normal brain death never actually occurred. The embalming chemicals that had been circulating through Lauren's system for nearly an hour should have been fatal, yet blood tests showed that her organs had somehow metabolized and eliminated them without permanent damage. This was perhaps the most medically impossible aspect of her survival. Embalming fluid is designed to preserve dead tissue by replacing blood and stopping cellular activity. For a living person to survive exposure to these chemicals, especially in the quantities used during preparation, should have been impossible. Lauren spent 6 days in the hospital undergoing tests and monitoring. Physically, she recovered completely from her accident injuries, showing healing that medical professionals described as unprecedented for someone who had suffered such severe trauma. Psychologically, her recovery was more complex. During our final conversation before she was discharged from the hospital, Lauren described her experience during the time she was considered dead. "I wasn't unconscious," she told me. "I was aware of everything that was happening, but I couldn't respond or communicate. I heard the paramedics pronouncing me dead. I felt myself being moved to the morgue. I was aware of the cold, the darkness, the complete isolation." She paused, looking directly at me with those same green eyes that had stared at me from the preparation table. But the worst part was knowing that everyone thought I was gone, that no one was looking for signs that I was still there. I was trapped in my own body, screaming silently for help that never came. Lauren's description of her experience raised disturbing questions about consciousness, death, and the possibility that other patients who appear to be deceased might actually be aware but unable to communicate. Her case sparked discussions in the medical community about improving procedures for determining death and the ethical implications of assuming unconsciousness in apparently deceased patients. The investigation into Lauren's case ultimately concluded that she had been in an extremely rare medical condition known as suspended animation, or apparent death, where vital signs become so faint that they cannot be detected by standard medical examination. However, this explanation was unsatisfactory to many medical professionals who pointed out that such cases typically last minutes or hours, not days, and don't include survival after embalming procedures. For me personally, Lauren's case changed everything about how I approached my work as a mortician. The possibility that other apparently deceased patients might retain some level of consciousness made every case more complex and emotionally challenging. I began paying closer attention to subtle signs that might indicate awareness, though I never encountered another case like Lauren's. The funeral home implemented new procedures requiring multiple confirmations of death before beginning preparation, including waiting periods and additional medical consultations. These changes were partly driven by legal concerns following Lauren's case, but also by the recognition that our understanding of death and consciousness might be incomplete. 6 months after her revival, Lauren returned to work as a pediatric nurse, though she specialized in working with coma patients and families dealing with difficult end-of-life decisions. She became an advocate for patients in vegetative states and worked to improve protocols for determining consciousness in apparently unresponsive individuals. "My experience taught me that consciousness might persist in ways we don't understand," she told me during a follow-up interview. "If there's even a possibility that someone who appears to be unconscious might actually be aware, we owe it to them to assume they can hear us and treat them with the dignity and respect we would give to any conscious person." The night of October 31st, 2023, remains the most terrifying experience of my career, not because of anything supernatural or unexplained in a mystical sense, but because it revealed how much we don't understand about the boundary between life and death. The possibility that consciousness might persist beyond what medical science can detect, that people we believe to be deceased might actually be aware and trapped in unresponsive bodies, represents a horror more profound than any ghost story or supernatural phenomenon. Lauren McIntyre's case demonstrated that death, which we treat as a clear and definitive boundary, might actually be more complex and mysterious than we realize. The implications for medical practice, end-of-life care, and funeral preparation are staggering. How many other patients might have been conscious while appearing to be deceased? How many families have mourned loved ones who might still have been aware and listening? These questions continue to haunt me, not just as a mortician, but as someone who has witnessed the impossible and been forced to confront the limitations of human knowledge about consciousness and death. Lauren's revival during embalming was medically impossible, yet it happened. Her survival of preservation chemicals should have been fatal, yet she recovered completely. The case has been studied by medical researchers, documented in journals, and discussed at conferences around the world, but no conclusive explanation has ever been established for how Lauren McIntyre could be pronounced dead, stored in a morgue for 48 hours, and then wake up during embalming with full consciousness and no permanent damage. What disturbs me most is not the mystery of how Lauren survived, but the realization that she was conscious and aware during those 2 days when everyone believed she was dead. She heard conversations, felt sensations, experienced the terror of being trapped in an unresponsive body, while medical professionals and family members discussed her as if she were already gone. The thought that other patients in morgues, funeral homes, and even hospitals might be experiencing similar awareness while appearing to be deceased represents a kind of horror that goes beyond anything I had previously imagined in my work with the dead. It suggests that our understanding of consciousness, death, and the boundary between the living and deceased is fundamentally incomplete and potentially flawed in ways that could have profound ethical and practical consequences. Lauren McIntyre's case will forever change how I approach my work as a mortician and how I think about the nature of death itself. The possibility that consciousness might persist beyond medical detection means that every case must be approached with the assumption that awareness might remain, even when all evidence suggests otherwise. The most terrifying aspect of that Halloween night was not witnessing the impossible revival of someone who should have been dead, but discovering that death itself might not be the clear, definitive boundary we believe it to be. The implications of Lauren's survival extend far beyond a single remarkable case to fundamental questions about consciousness, medical practice, and the respect we owe to those who appear to be deceased, but might actually still be aware and listening to everything we say and do around them. This remains the most unexplained and troubling case of my career, because it revealed that the people we believe to be gone might actually still be present, conscious, and desperately trying to communicate their continued existence to a world that has already written them off as dead.